It began with an invitation that felt more like a challenge. Kash Patel had agreed to appear on the Rachel Maddow Show, fully aware that the stage was not set for a friendly exchange. But he welcomed the fire. He had nothing to hide. And more importantly, he had something to say. The studio lights were hot. The air was sharp with tension, even before the cameras started rolling. Rachel Maddow adjusted her notes, eyes flicking across the desk to where Kash sat, calm and unreadable. "Tonight," she said, turning to the camera, "we are joined by a former senior official in the Trump administration, a man whose name has appeared in some of the most controversial intelligence stories of the last decade." Kash nodded slightly. He had been called worse. "Let's start with the truth," Rachel said. "Were you or were you not involved in efforts to discredit the FBI's findings during the Russia investigation?" Kash looked directly at her. "I was involved in uncovering the truth behind a politically motivated investigation. That's not the same thing as discrediting it. That's accountability." The room felt smaller already. Rachel's voice did not waver. "That sounds like spin," she replied. "Because what the public saw was a coordinated attempt to undermine institutions." The public, Kash said, leaning forward slightly, was fed a narrative built on selective leaks and media pressure. What I did was ask for transparency. What you're calling undermining was actually asking for facts. Rachel tightened her jaw. And just like that, the tone had been set. Every question that followed was edged with implication. Every answer Kash gave was parsed in real time, framed for doubt. The conversation moved like a chess match, controlled, calculated, tense. But it wasn't until Rachel brought up the leaked memo that the energy shifted. She held up a printed page. "This document," she said, "has your name on it. And it suggests that you pushed for intelligence reports to be altered. Can you explain that?" Kash didn't blink. "I can explain that the document you're holding was never authenticated. It was leaked without context and without chain of custody. That's not journalism. That's narrative warfare." He said it without raising his voice. But his words landed like glass on concrete. Rachel replied quickly, but her pace had changed. Less control, more reaction. The script she had prepared was slipping, and the audience could feel it. By the time they cut to commercial, the control room was buzzing. Producers whispered. Stage assistants hovered. And Rachel sat still, staring at her notes like they had betrayed her. But Kash just waited. The real clash was still coming. When they came back from commercial, the energy in the studio had changed. The applause sign lit up, but few clapped. Viewers at home would only see polished smiles. But inside the room, even the sound engineer could feel the tension spreading like smoke. Rachel Maddow opened the second segment with a clipped tone. "Let's talk about the Ukraine whistleblower," she said. "Were you aware that your communications were mentioned in the classified appendix?" Kash Patel didn't flinch. "I'm aware that certain people in the intelligence community were more concerned with shaping headlines than protecting national security. And I'm also aware that I never broke the law." Rachel narrowed her eyes. "You keep using that phrase. But legality isn't always the same as ethics." "Agreed," Kash said. "So let's talk about ethics. Is it ethical to run a primetime news program that relies on anonymous sources and speculative claims, night after night, knowing that most of them never get corrected?" The silence in the studio was sudden and brutal. One of the camera operators momentarily missed a focus shift. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "That's an interesting accusation," she said slowly, "coming from someone whose own party has routinely dismissed fact-checking as media bias." "It's not an accusation," Kash replied. "It's a pattern, and you're part of it." He wasn't raising his voice, but he didn't have to. Every word was sharpened by certainty. And Rachel, for the first time in the segment, had no comeback ready. Instead, she pivoted. She shifted to January 6th. She brought up quotes, headlines, committee footage. She listed names. She implied alliances. "You were chief of staff at the Department of Defense during that time," she said. "Are you prepared to take responsibility for the delay in military response?" Kash shook his head. "What I'm prepared to do is correct the record. The Pentagon offered National Guard assistance days before. That offer was declined by those who had jurisdiction. You can check the timeline. It's public record. And yet," Rachel pressed, "you waited hours to deploy forces." We followed the chain of command, Kash replied, and every delay was logged, which is more than I can say for the coverage that followed. Rachel turned toward the camera with a small sigh, clearly ready to move on. But Kash wasn't done. I didn't come here to play defense, he said quietly. I came here to expose how truth gets buried under convenience. And you've just helped make that case. For a second, Rachel looked like she might end the interview early. But then a voice crackled in her earpiece. Producers were now debating live whether to pull the next segment entirely. Something had slipped beyond their control, and the next question would push it past the point of recovery. Rachel Maddow adjusted her papers, even though nothing on them had changed. She looked into the camera, then back at Kash Patel. So let me ask you this directly, she said. Do you still believe the 2020 election was conducted fairly and without interference? The audience drew a sharp breath. Kash didn't blink. I believe the process was full of irregularities, he said. And I believe asking questions about that process is not sedition. It's citizenship. Rachel leaned forward. Every court challenge failed. The Department of Justice found no widespread fraud. Multiple audits in multiple states all confirmed the outcome. So what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Kash said slowly, that when half the country loses faith in the process, you don't mock them. You don't silence them. You ask why. The weight of that landed harder than the question itself. Rachel sat back. Her voice softened. And if asking why leads to violence? To chaos? To the erosion of trust in democratic institutions? Kash's eyes narrowed. Then the answer isn't to shut down dissent. The answer is transparency, not narrative control, not censorship. He looked directly at her now. You think I'm here defending a candidate? I'm not. I'm defending a principle. That asking hard questions is not a threat to democracy. Suppressing them is. Rachel exhaled slowly, but the moment had already shifted. The audience, once skeptical, was now divided. Some nodded. Others crossed their arms. The control room stayed quiet. No one wanted to be the first to call it. Rachel spoke again, but her voice was cooler now. You've built a reputation on being confrontational, she said. But tonight, it sounds a lot like you're rehearsing. Kash's response was immediate. I don't need a script to speak the truth. And I'm not the one avoiding the hard parts. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Such as your silence when the intelligence community leaked classified information selectively to damage political enemies. Where were your monologues then? A beat passed. Rachel glanced off camera. One of her producers gave her a subtle cue. Thank you for your time tonight, she said. We're going to have to leave it there. Kash didn't move. I'm sure you will. And with that, he removed his microphone and stood. A few audience members clapped out of reflex. Others sat still, unsure what they'd just witnessed. Rachel tried to close the segment with her usual polished line, but the words didn't land. Because Kash Patel had already walked off stage. And the room still echoed with the one thing nobody had expected. Uncomfortable truth. The clip of Kash Patel leaving the stage didn't even finish airing before social media lit up in all directions. Some called it a setup. Others called it justified. But no one could deny what they saw. Rachel Maddow sat at her desk, facing the camera, but her usual closing energy was gone. Her team was scrambling behind the scenes, debating whether to address it further or pivot to the next segment. In the control room, a producer whispered, he just walked straight out. No handler, no pause. Straight through the hallway and gone. The silence in the studio remained. Rachel turned to the next guest, but the moment never recovered. Backstage, a production assistant found Kash standing alone near the service elevator. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't looking for validation. He just stood there, calm and still. The assistant hesitated before speaking. Sir, I've worked here a long time. I've never seen that happen before. Kash didn't respond immediately. Then he said, it's because no one ever pushes back here. Not really. And when someone does, they pretend it's chaos. The assistant wasn't sure what to say. She just nodded, then quietly walked away. Later that night, while the clip of the confrontation made headlines, something unexpected began to happen. People on both sides of the political divide began reposting a specific moment. It wasn't the argument. It wasn't the walk-off. It was a sentence. When half the country loses faith in the process, you don't mock them. You ask why? That line spread fast. Not because it was loud, but because it felt uncomfortably true. Rachel Maddow's team released a statement saying she welcomes spirited debate and stands by her journalistic integrity. Kash Patel posted nothing, not even a reaction. But in the days that followed, new interview requests poured in. Not from cable news, from college campuses, from podcasts, from people who didn't even agree with Kash politically, but said they wanted to hear someone speak without flinching. What had started as a tense exchange on television became something else entirely. Not because it was explosive, but because it refused to be defused. 3 days after the broadcast, the clip had been viewed over 20 million times. But for Kash Patel, the number didn't matter. He hadn't set out to go viral. He had walked into that studio believing it might be possible to have a real conversation. And he had walked out knowing that conversation was never welcome to begin with. What stayed with Kash wasn't the debate. It wasn't even Rachel's smirk or the way security had followed him to the door. It was the way the audience had reacted, the way some had laughed, the way others had looked down, embarrassed. That mix of mockery and silence. Kash kept playing it back in his mind, not because it wounded him, but because it revealed something deeper, something he knew too many Americans had felt in their own lives. The feeling of being unwelcome. Not because of how you said something, but simply because you dared to say it. He knew people were watching, trying to read into his next move. But Kash didn't launch a campaign. He didn't call for boycotts or fire back with insults. He just kept showing up. One day he was speaking at a high school in Michigan. The next, he was sitting on a local AM radio station in Ohio. Places most political figures ignored unless there were votes to win. But Kash wasn't trying to win anything. He was trying to reach the people who had watched him stand on national television and get told, indirectly, that his viewpoint didn't belong. The hosts of other shows reached out. Some were eager to capitalize on the moment. Others were cautiously curious. But Kash only said yes to the ones who didn't start the conversation with a pre-written script. 1 week later, a university student from North Carolina posted a clip from a panel discussion where Kash had been invited to speak alongside a progressive professor. The student captioned it, "This is what disagreement without hatred looks like. Wish we saw more of it on TV." It got fewer views than the Maddow clip, but it hit differently. And slowly, quietly, something began to shift. People weren't just talking about the moment Kash walked off. They were talking about the way he walked away, with dignity, not fury, with clarity, not chaos. And that, more than anything, was what stuck.